The following presentation is a basic overview of the supplement not supplant requirement that is part of many federal education programs. During the course of the presentation, we will discuss the purpose of the SNS provision and the resources that are available. We will discuss the traditional method of determining compliance with the SNS requirement, which applies to most programs that are subject to the provision, as well as the Title I Part A methodology. We will discuss the specifics of the Title I methodology requirements and the exemptions that may apply. And lastly, we will discuss how this requirement is monitored. First, the purpose of the provision. The purpose of the SNS provision is to help ensure that federal grant funds are expended to benefit the intended population, not diverted to cover the expenses that the LEA would have paid for out of other funds in the event that federal funds were not available. The U.S. Department of Education released a non-regulatory informational document on supplement not supplant in June of 2019. The Texas Education Agency used this information to revise its supplement not supplant handbook. The SNS handbook describes the traditional SNS documentation in Section A and the Title I Part A methodology documentation in Section B. The programs that use the traditional way of documenting SNS compliance are Title I Part C, Title I Part D, Title II Part A, Title III Part A, Title IV Part A, Title IV Part B, Rural and Low-Income Schools Program, IDEA, Perkins, and the McKinney-Vento Act. Programs covered by the SNS methodology that was established under the Every Student Succeeds Act are Title I Part A and Title I School Improvement. The wording of the SNS provision is slightly different in each statute. The SNS handbook has a reference chart on pages 2 and 3 that lists each program and its specific SNS language. In the next section, we will distinguish between the traditional SNS and the Title I Part A methodology. Most federal programs with an SNS provision still use traditional documentation. The program activities must be shown to enhance, expand, or extend required activities. When checking for traditional SNS compliance, auditors will presume that a supplant has occurred if LEAs have used any program funds to do any of the following: to provide services required by state or local law, to provide the same services as those provided in prior school year with state or local funds, or to provide the same services in federal and non-federal programs. There are circumstances where it may be possible to rebut the presumption of supplanting, but the LEA is responsible for providing documentation to do this. Documentation might include documentation of a rescission of funds or a budget reduction, or documentation that a prior fund source is no longer available. There are some standard questions for an LEA to ask to determine whether a particular service or activity is supplemental. Is the activity or service required by state or local law? Did the LEA provide this activity or service in the prior year? What funds did the LEA use to provide the activity or service? Is the activity or service provided with federal funds to some recipients and with state and local funds to other recipients? For example, if an LEA wants to purchase 25 new security cameras, is it all right to use Title IV Part A funds for this? It depends. It's going to look different at different LEAs. If the LEA previously purchased security cameras with state or local funds, this could be a supplant. To rebut the presumption of supplant, the LEA must document that funds that were previously used are no longer available. The next part of the presentation will cover the Title I Part A SNS Methodology documentation. Just as a reminder, the Title I SNS Methodology is only applicable to Title I Part A and to Title I School Improvement. Every LEA that accepts Title I Part A or school improvement funds must have either a written methodology for allocating its state and local funds or a statement of exemption from the methodology requirement. Let's cover the exemptions first. Guidance from the U.S. Department of Education has established several categories of exemption from the SNS methodology. LEAs with a single campus, LEAs with a single campus per category, and LEAs with all Title I Part A campuses. We'll go over each one of these separately. An LEA that has only one campus is exempt from the SNS methodology requirement. An LEA that has only one campus per campus category with no duplication of grades is exempt from the SNS methodology requirement. So an LEA with one elementary school, one middle school, and one high school would only have to have a statement of exemption. An LEA with all Title I Part A campuses is also exempt from the SNS methodology requirement. This would be true no matter how many campuses the LEA has. If all of those campuses are Title I Part A campuses, the LEA is exempt from the SNS methodology requirement. Guidance from the U.S. Department of Education has expanded the exemption to campus categories. For example, a single campus in a campus category could be excluded even if the rest of the campuses in the LEA needed to have a SNS methodology. In this example, the LEA has several elementary schools that are mixed Title I and non-Title I, several middle schools that are mixed Title I and non-Title I, and a single high school that is a Title I campus. In this example, the single high school could be excluded from the SNS methodology. The LEA would only have to have the methodology cover its elementary and middle school campuses. The campus category has only non-Title I campuses. It could also be exempt. In this example, the LEA has a single high school. All of its middle schools are non-Title I campuses, and it has a mix of Title I and non-Title I elementary schools. The single high school could be excluded because it only has one campus in that category. The middle schools could be excluded from the methodology because all of them are non-Title I schools. In this particular example, because there is a mix of elementary schools, the LEA would still have to have an SNS methodology that covered the elementary school campuses only. In the event that all of the elementary schools were Title I, the elementary schools could also be excluded. In this example, each campus category is excluded, which would then, by definition, qualify the LEA to have a statement of exemption instead of an SNS methodology for its campuses. Now it's time for a pop quiz. It's self-graded, don't worry. In this example, the LEA has two campuses, a PK through 8 campus and a 9 through 12 campus. Would it be exempt or not exempt from the SNS methodology requirement? Because there is only a single campus per campus category and no duplication of grades, the LEA would be exempt. In this example, there are 2 elementary campuses, 2 middle school campuses, and 1 high school campus. Would the LEA be exempt or not exempt from the Title I SNS methodology requirement? It's a trick question. You don't have enough information to answer that question. What else would you need to know? You would need to know which campuses are Title I. So if you were told that there were 2 elementary campuses, one of which was Title I and one of which was not Title I, 2 middle school campuses, neither of which were Title I, and 1 high school that is not Title I, would this LEA be exempt or not exempt? The single high school could be excluded from the methodology. The middle school campuses, which are all non-Title I, could be excluded from the methodology. There's a mix of elementary schools, Title I and non-Title I. This particular LEA would not be exempt from the SNS methodology requirement. It would need to have a methodology for its elementary schools, although it would not have to include its middle school or high school campuses. If the LEA has 2 elementary schools that are both Title I, 2 middle schools that are not Title I, and 1 high school, is it exempt or not exempt? The single high school could be excluded. The middle schools could be excluded because all of them are non-Title I. The elementary schools could be excluded because they are all Title I. Because all campus categories can be excluded, the LEA is exempt from the SNS methodology requirement. It would only have to have the statement of exemption. To assist the LEA in creating its statement of exemption, a template has been provided in the SNS handbook in Section F. The next section of the presentation will cover the SNS methodology options and requirements. The primary Title I SNS methodology requirement is that the LEA allocate its state and local funds to its campuses without regard to their Title I status. In other words, the methodology has to be Title I neutral. The LEA has options in deciding the basis for its state and local allocations, as well as the type of methodology it wants to have. For example, it's the LEA's choice as to whether its methodology will be applied district-wide or by campus category. It's possible for the LEA to have one methodology for its elementary campuses and another methodology for its middle school campuses. If the LEA chooses the district-wide methodology, it would apply the same methodology to all of its campuses. If it decides to do it by campus category, it could have a separate methodology for each type of campus. In terms of the methodology type, the LEA has several choices. The LEA could choose to have its methodology done by student, which would be basically a per pupil amount. It could establish a weighted per pupil amount based on student characteristics. It could distribute funds based on personnel and non-personnel costs. It could have a combination of these, or it could create its own. The overriding requirement for the methodology is that it be Title I neutral, that state and local funds are distributed to its campuses without regard to their Title I status. Guidance from the U.S. Department of Education has provided some flexibility for the personnel, non-personnel cost category. For example, the LEA would allocate personnel cost for 6,100 based on a staffing pattern. So think allocating staff, not allocating dollars. This relieves the LEA from concerns like staff salary differentials based on insurance choices, longevity, that sort of thing. The LEA could basically allocate staff according to a staffing pattern without regard to whether a campus was Title I. Non-personnel costs, 6,200 to 6,600, the LEA could use any of the previous choices based on per pupil amounts, weighted per pupil amounts, or some other combination that the LEA chooses. The LEA would simply write the description in the methodology so that the auditor would understand how the LEA distributed funds to its campuses, state and local funds to its campuses. Once the LEA has its statement of exemption or its methodology for allocating state and local funds to its campuses, it is in compliance with the SNS requirement for Title I Part A and for Title I School Improvement. With regard to the Title I Part A funds that may be reserved at the LEA level, the LEA must ensure that any state and local funds that are retained at the LEA level will be used in a Title I neutral manner, and that any Title I Part A funds that are reserved at the LEA level will only be used for Title I Part A purposes as indicated in the LEA's approved ESSA Consolidated Federal Grant application. Let's turn now to monitoring for the SNS requirement. Monitoring for the supplement not supplant requirement will be conducted primarily by the Federal Fiscal Monitoring Division at TEA through their usual monitoring reviews. There will also be a program implementation question related to Title I SNS on the 2020-2021 compliance report. This requirement will also be subject to a potential random validation. In terms of traditional supplement not supplant requirements, auditors will be applying the presumptions of supplanting as was discussed in this presentation. Title I Part A SNS monitoring will look at a copy of the district's SNS methodology or the statement of exemption. Auditors will also be looking for a connection between the amounts generated by the methodology and the amounts for the campuses recorded in the general ledger. Questions related to supplement not supplant may be directed to Vivian Smurl at viviansmurl@tea.texas.gov or to the division email at essasupport@tea.texas.gov.